Welcome back, everybody. You guys have given us some pretty fascinating stuff to look at for this deep dive.
Yeah, it looks like it.
It looks like mostly academic papers on like the history of mental disorders and how we classify them.
Hmm.
I see unit-1.pdf, unit-2.pdf, unit-3, and unit-4.
Okay.
So it seems like we'll be kind of tracing how our understanding of psychopathology has evolved over time.
Yeah, going way back to ancient beliefs
Right.
and moving all the way to like the modern diagnostic manuals like the DSM.
Exactly. And I think what's so interesting about this is that it really reveals a lot about how we view mental health even today.
It really does.
So you might be surprised to learn that like way back when, for centuries really, people thought that abnormal behaviors were caused by supernatural forces.
Oh, yeah.
Things like witchcraft or demonic possession.
Like if someone was acting really strangely, they would think that they were
Right.
possessed by a demon or something.
They even drilled holes into skulls. I think it was called trepanation.
Trepanation, yeah.
Yep. To release these evil spirits.
Yeah, I mean, it might seem crazy now, but it just shows how deeply they believe that mental distress came from outside forces.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, like, did they ever just think like, oh, maybe this person's just having a really bad day?
Right, right.
Yeah.
The idea of mental illness as we know it didn't really exist back then.
Right, right.
But the ancient Greeks, they were really starting to move away from those supernatural explanations.
Oh, the Greeks always got to be different.
Yeah, well, they gave us a lot of important ideas,
That's true.
and they started to look at things in a new way.
Yeah, tell me more about that.
Okay, so think of Hippocrates. You know, he's considered the father of medicine. He challenged those supernatural explanations
Okay.
for mental illness and suggested that it could have natural biological causes.
So instead of blaming like a demon, they started looking at the body itself.
Exactly. He came up with this theory of the four humors:
Okay.
blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of this.
And he thought that if those humors were out of balance, it would cause both mental and physical illnesses.
So no demons, but now we've got bodily fluids to blame.
Pretty much.
Wow.
But the point is, this was a big step towards thinking about the biology of mental health,
Right.
even if the specifics weren't quite right.
So how did they try to treat mental illness based on this theory?
Well, they thought they could restore balance to the humors
Okay.
with treatments like bloodletting
Bloodletting. That sounds awful.
or making people vomit.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, not very pleasant, but that's what they did back then.
Right, right.
But the important thing here is that they were moving away from the supernatural and towards biological explanations.
Right, and that would influence how we view mental health even today.
Absolutely.
This makes me think of the word lunatic, which we now recognize as not very nice.
Oh, yeah.
But it actually comes from the Latin word for moon, luna.
That's right.
And it shows how long those old beliefs stuck around.
Yeah, even as the Greeks were starting to think differently, those older ideas were still really influential.
Yeah, new ideas don't just appear overnight.
It takes time for them to take root.
Speaking of new ideas taking root, I'm really interested in this idea of moral therapy.
Oh, yeah. That was a big turning point.
Yeah, this seems like a huge shift in how we thought about and treated people with mental illness.
It was a huge shift. Moral therapy emerged in like the 18th and 19th centuries, and it was totally different from how things were done before
Okay.
because it advocated for treating people with mental illness humanely.
Okay, so instead of being locked away and feared,
Right.
people with mental illness were seen as individuals deserving of compassion and care.
Exactly. And they recognized that people with mental illness had the potential to heal.
Wow, what a change.
Yeah, so there were key figures like Philippe Pinel in France and Dorothea Dix in the United States
Yeah.
who fought for asylum reform.
Okay.
So they were advocating for better conditions in asylums and more therapeutic environments.
Okay, so that sounds like a major step forward. But how did those reforms actually translate into treatment? What was moral therapy like in practice?
Well, it focused on creating structure for the patients, having routines, and also engaging the patients in meaningful activities.
Okay.
And fostering a sense of community within the asylums.
Okay, so it was really about creating an environment that supported mental well-being.
Yeah, instead of one that further isolated and stigmatized people.
It seems like this is laying the foundation for the more modern approaches to mental health care that we use today.
Absolutely. It was a major shift in thinking.
But we can't talk about mental health without talking about Freud, right?
No, Freud is definitely a pivotal figure in this story.
Yeah.
His ideas completely changed how we understand the mind.
And this was in the late 19th and early 20th century, right?
That's right.
And he really focused on the unconscious, right?
Right. He believed the unconscious mind was a powerful force that shaped our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
And the material you gave me mentions some of his key concepts: the id, ego, and superego.
Right. Those were central to his theory.
Can you remind us what those are all about?
Okay, so Freud believed that the mind was divided into these three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego.
Okay.
So the id is like the most primitive part of the mind.
Okay.
It's driven by our basic instincts and desires, pleasure-seeking.
Okay.
And then there's the superego, which represents our moral conscience, or sense of right and wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the ego, and that's the part that's caught in the middle,
Okay.
trying to balance the demands of the id and the superego.
So it's like a constant tug of war inside our mind.
Exactly. And Freud believed that unresolved conflicts between these parts, often stemming from our childhood experiences,
Yeah.
could lead to mental distress.
Wow, that's pretty intense.
Yeah, well, Freud's theories were definitely controversial, but they had a huge impact on how we think about personality, mental health, and therapy.
So how did he try to access those unconscious conflicts?
Well, he developed some really unique techniques,
Okay.
like dream analysis, where he would try to interpret the hidden meanings of dreams.
Mm.
And then there was free association, where he would just encourage patients to say whatever came to mind without censoring themselves.
So it was like trying to decode a secret language?
Yeah.
Kinda?
But Freud wasn't the only one who was influencing how we thought about mental health, right?
Oh, definitely not. There were other important figures at the same time.
Okay.
While Freud was focused on the unconscious, there was another school of thought that emerged
Okay.
called humanistic psychology.
Okay. And this is a more optimistic perspective.
Yes, much more optimistic.
Okay.
They focused on human potential and growth rather than just on our problems.
Tell me more. This sounds interesting.
Okay, so think about figures like Carl Rogers. He was a major figure in humanistic psychology,
Okay.
and he believed that all humans have an inherent drive towards self-actualization, towards becoming the best version of themselves.
Okay. I like that idea. Right. It's very positive and empowering.
So what did he think caused mental distress?
He thought that it often stemmed from a lack of congruence
Okay.
between our true selves and the self that we feel pressured to present to the world.
So it's about being true to ourselves and living authentically.
Exactly. Humanistic psychology put a lot of emphasis on personal growth, self-acceptance, and the importance of genuine human connection.
It's like a breath of fresh air compared to Freud's theories.
It is. It's very different.
But I remember reading that there was also a movement that focused on what was observable rather than just the mysteries of the unconscious mind.
Oh, you're thinking of behaviorism,
Yes.
which came about in the early 20th century.
Okay.
And behaviorists like John B. Watson
Okay.
and B.F. Skinner, they believed that psychology should focus only on things you could observe,
Okay.
observable behaviors and how they were learned, rather than on internal mental states.
So instead of trying to figure out the unconscious, they focused on what they could actually see and measure.
Exactly. They were interested in how we learn through things like classical conditioning and operant conditioning,
Right.
how that shapes our behaviors, both good and bad.
This reminds me of Pavlov's dogs salivating at the sound of a bell.
Yes. That's the perfect example of classical conditioning.
But they applied this to way more than just dogs.
Right. It wasn't just about dogs.
Okay.
It was about how we learn in general, how we form associations,
Okay.
and how those associations can influence our behavior.
And they use these principles to try to understand and treat a bunch of different mental health issues. Right?
Yes, all sorts of things, from phobias to anxiety to depression.
So how would a behaviorist approach something like a phobia? Like if someone's afraid of spiders?
Well, they might use something called systematic desensitization,
Okay.
which is where you gradually expose the person to the thing they're afraid of, like spiders.
Okay.
But you do it very slowly and carefully.
Right.
And at the same time, you teach them relaxation techniques to help them manage their anxiety. So basically, you're breaking the link between the spider
Yeah.
and the fear response.
So it's like rewiring the brain.
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
It's amazing how many different ways people have tried to understand the mind.
It is.
So we've gone from demons to bodily fluids to the unconscious
Right.
to focusing on behavior. And now we're talking about rewiring the brain.
That's a good summary.
And behaviorism, it didn't stop there, right?
It evolved, yeah.
Okay.
Eventually, it started to incorporate cognitive factors.
So now it's not just about outward behaviors,
Yeah.
but also about what's happening inside our heads, our thoughts and beliefs.
Exactly. Because they realized that our thoughts play a huge role in how we feel and how we act.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from ancient beliefs all the way to modern psychology.
And we've seen how our understanding of psychopathology has really evolved over time.
It's been quite a journey.
It has, and this journey is still continuing as we learn more about the complexities of the human mind. But before we move on to the next part of this deep dive, I just want to take a moment to appreciate how far we've come.
Yeah.
From blaming demons to recognizing that mental health is complex and multifaceted.
It's truly amazing.
It is, and this understanding will continue to guide us as we explore how we classify and diagnose mental disorders.
Well, I'm ready to keep exploring.
Okay, great. Then let's dive into the world of those diagnostic manuals and see what we can learn.
Sounds good.
Okay, so welcome back to our deep dive into the world of psychopathology. We've already talked about how our understanding of mental health has changed so much over time.
It's amazing, right? We've come a long way from blaming demons and evil spirits.
Exactly, and now we're going to jump into these classification systems, the ICD and the DSM that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I'm really curious about these. Like, how do they actually work?
Okay, so imagine them as like detailed maps of mental health.
Okay.
They provide this framework for how we diagnose and talk about and research mental disorders.
That makes sense. But maps can be tricky, can't they? I mean, they don't always show like all the tiny details of the real world.
That's a great point. And the DSM, especially, has had its fair share of debate and criticism.
Okay.
But let's start with the basics. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's the main system they use here in the U.S.
Okay.
And it's gone through quite a few revisions since it first came out back in 1952.
The material you sent me mentions something called a multi-axial system that was used in some earlier versions of the DSM. What
Yeah.
was that all about?
Okay, imagine you're trying to understand someone's mental health. You wouldn't just focus on one symptom, right?
No, of course not.
You'd want to look at their personality, their physical health, their social life, all the things that make up their well-being.
So it's about getting the big picture, not just a tiny snapshot.
Exactly. And that's what this multi-axial system was trying to do. It had 5 axes, and each one focused on a different part of a person's mental health.
Okay, take me through those axes. What were they looking at?
All right, so axis I was all about the clinical diagnoses. Things like depression, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, the conditions we usually think of when we hear mental illness.
Okay, got it. So that's the big, most noticeable feature, like a mountain range on a map.
I like that, yeah. Then you moved to axis tistin, which was for personality disorders and intellectual disability. These are more like long-term patterns of thinking and behavior that affects someone's life.
Okay, so still part of the map, but maybe more like the underlying geology that shapes everything else.
Perfect analogy. And then we've got axis to third, and this one was for medical conditions because our physical health can really affect our mental health and the other way around too.
It's all connected. Like chronic pain can lead to depression or anxiety can make asthma worse.
Absolutely. And we look at the social and environmental stuff with axis fourth. This axis was about the stressors in someone's life that might be affecting their mental health.
Like if they lose their job, have relationship problems, or experience trauma, all those outside forces that can weigh heavily on us.
Exactly. And finally, we get to axis V, which had a global assessment of functioning score, or GAF score.
Okay.
It was basically a number from 1 to 100 that rated the person's overall functioning, like how well they're doing socially, at work, and just psychologically.
So like zooming out to see how well someone is doing in life. Big picture.
Exactly. It tried to show how complicated a person's experience really is.
This multi-axial system sounds pretty thorough, but you mentioned that the DSM has gotten some criticism. What are some of the issues people have with it?
Well, one big criticism is that the DSM uses categories to diagnose people, like you either have depression or you don't. But critics say mental distress doesn't always fit neatly into boxes like that.
So instead of just saying you have depression, it's more about realizing that there are different levels of severity and everyone experiences things differently.
That's the idea. And this leads into another criticism, that it focuses too much on symptoms we can see on the surface. The DSM relies on observable behaviors and what people say they're feeling. But critics say that doesn't always show the real complexity of what's going on.
It's like trying to figure out what's wrong with a car just by listening to the engine make a weird noise. You might miss something really important happening inside.
I love that. And this brings up another problem, the potential for overdiagnosis. Like, we might start calling normal human experiences a disorder.
So like feeling sad after a breakup or being nervous before a big presentation, those are normal reactions, not a mental illness, right?
Exactly. And this worry becomes even bigger when we think about drug companies, because some people say they have a reason to make more diagnoses to sell more meds.
Okay, so we're dealing with ethical and financial concerns here.
Absolutely.
But what about culture? The material we're looking at seems very Western-centric.
That's a very important point. The DSM was mostly developed using Western ideas,
Mhm.
which might not work for other cultures.
Right.
What's considered a disorder in one culture might be totally normal in another.
So using the DSM in different cultures can be tricky and sometimes even harmful.
Yes, and these criticisms are really important. They make us think about how we diagnose mental illness, do more research, and keep making our systems better. It's a reminder that we're always learning and that there's always more to discover about mental health.
So the DSM is a useful tool, but we have to be careful and sensitive when using it. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right. We need to approach mental health with nuance, humility, and an open mind.
Well said. Now, I'm kind of eager to shift gears here and get back to those childhood disorders we touched on earlier.
Sure.
I'd love to dive a little deeper into autism spectrum disorder.
Okay, great. Autism, or ASD, is a neurodevelopmental disorder that affects how people communicate, interact, and behave socially. And it's a spectrum, meaning it affects everyone differently. Some people have mild symptoms, while others have more severe challenges.
Yeah, and I remember reading that people with autism often struggle with social cues, like they have trouble understanding things like body language or tone of voice, and they find it hard to have back and forth conversations.
It's like they're trying to navigate a world where everyone is speaking a different language. They might miss subtle facial expressions or have trouble understanding jokes or sarcasm.
It sounds incredibly isolating, like trying to play a game without knowing the rules.
Exactly. And along with the social challenges, a lot of people with autism also have these very specific, repetitive behaviors or interests.
Okay.
They might get really focused on certain topics or do the same movements over and over again, and they often don't like changes in their routine.
Almost like their world is run by a different set of rules or a different operating system.
That's a really interesting way to put it. These repetitive behaviors can actually be calming for people with autism. They make them feel safe and in control when things feel overwhelming.
So while these behaviors might seem strange to us, they're actually serving an important purpose. It's a good reminder to be curious and understanding instead of judging.
I agree. And it's important to remember that people with autism have all sorts of different abilities and strengths. Some people might not speak at all, while others are very verbal and intellectually gifted. The spectrum is really vast and diverse.
The material we're looking at also mentioned Asperger's syndrome, which I remember used to be a separate diagnosis, but is now considered part of the autism spectrum. What's the difference?
So people with Asperger's typically have average or above average intelligence, and their language develops normally. But they still face those social challenges and often have those intense interests and repetitive behaviors.
Okay, so it's like a different spot on the autism spectrum with its own unique characteristics. And speaking of spectrums, let's talk about ADHD.
Okay, so ADHD, or Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, is another neurodevelopmental disorder that usually starts in childhood and can last into adulthood. It's marked by these core features: inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity.
I'm getting a pretty clear picture here. People with ADHD might have trouble focusing on tasks, fidget a lot, interrupt conversations, or act without thinking.
Imagine a mind that's constantly racing, jumping from one thought to another, making it almost impossible to tune out distractions and focus.
It's like trying to read a book while a marching band is practicing right outside your window.
Exactly. And all this mental activity makes it really hard to sit still, follow instructions, and control those impulsive urges. It's not that they don't want to pay attention or behave well. Their brains just work differently. It's much harder for them to control those functions.
So it's not about punishing kids with ADHD or making them feel ashamed. It's about understanding and supporting them.
Absolutely. They need strategies and help to manage their challenges, not criticism for something they can't fully control.
Now, this makes me think of something else I read about brain differences in people with ADHD. Is there any scientific evidence for that?
Oh, absolutely. Studies using brain imaging have shown differences in the areas of the brain that control attention, impulse control, and executive function in people with ADHD. This gives us biological proof that their struggles are real.
It's like finally having evidence that there's a difference, that it's not just about willpower or laziness. This biological understanding must be so validating for people with ADHD and their
It
families.
really is. It shifts the conversation from blame to understanding, which helps us find better ways to help and support people with ADHD.
Okay, so we've talked about autism and ADHD, which are two pretty complex neurodevelopmental disorders, but childhood doesn't stop there. This material also talks about oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder. What can you tell us about those?
These disorders are what we call disruptive behavior disorders. They involve patterns of defiant, hostile, and sometimes aggressive behavior.
So, oppositional defiant disorder, or ODD, is all about being negative, hostile, and defiant, right? And it usually shows up pretty early in childhood.
Yeah, kids with ODD might constantly argue with adults, refuse to follow rules, purposely annoy others, or blame others for their mistakes. This can really put a strain on families and make things tough in the classroom.
Sounds like a constant battle, a clash of wills that wears everyone down.
Exactly. And while all kids are defiant sometimes, ODD is about a persistent and constant pattern of these behaviors. It's more than just typical childhood rebellion.
So it's about how intense, how frequent, and how impactful these behaviors are.
Right.
And how does conduct disorder differ from ODD?
Conduct disorder, or CD, is more serious. It often involves violating other people's rights and breaking societal norms.
This material mentions some pretty serious behaviors associated with CD, like aggression towards people and animals, destroying property, lying and stealing, and seriously breaking rules.
These behaviors can be anything from bullying and fighting to vandalizing, setting fires, and even being cruel to animals. It's a serious condition that can have lasting effects on both the individual and society.
It's like ODD on steroids, with behaviors that can be really destructive and dangerous. It seems like early intervention is so important when it comes to these disorders.
It is. These disorders usually come from a mix of biological, environmental, and family factors. To treat them effectively, we have to understand what's causing them.
Well, we've certainly covered some tough stuff today looking at these complex childhood disorders, but before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on anxiety, specifically the types of anxiety that often show up in childhood.
Okay, yeah. Anxiety is a normal human emotion. It's how we react to threats or stress. But when it becomes excessive, when it doesn't go away, and it starts messing with our daily lives, then it might be an anxiety disorder.
And you mentioned separation anxiety disorder earlier, which is a common one in kids. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so separation anxiety disorder is when kids have this intense fear of being away from their parents or caregivers. It's normal for young kids to have a little separation anxiety, but when it becomes overwhelming, it's a problem.
The material we're looking at describes some really intense symptoms that come with separation anxiety disorder. Things like extreme distress when separated from loved ones, constant worry about something bad happening to them, not wanting to sleep alone, nightmares about separation, and even physical symptoms like headaches or stomach aches.
Imagine being a child who truly believes that something terrible will happen to their parents if they're not around. That's how real this fear is for them.
It's so sad. And those physical symptoms can make things even more complicated because sometimes kids end up having all sorts of medical tests before anyone realizes it's actually anxiety.
It shows how important it is to look at both the physical and psychological sides of things. If separation anxiety isn't treated, it can really affect a child's social life, their schoolwork, and their overall well-being.
So even though separation anxiety is common and treatable, it's not something to ignore. Finding it early and getting help is key.
Exactly. And speaking of challenges that often need special support and understanding, let's talk about ecvetic disorders.
Yeah, so these materials described Leidic disorders as these sudden, rapid, repeated movements or sounds that seem to happen involuntarily. Basically, Leidics are things someone feels like they have to do, even if they try to stop themselves.
Imagine having an itch you can't scratch or a word stuck in your throat you can't help but blurt out. That's kind of what it's like to have a tic.
And while most tics are mild and go away on their own, some can be more severe and stick around for a long time. Tourette syndrome is probably the most well-known eczetic disorder, right? It involves both motor and vocal tics that can be really complex and debilitating.
Right. Tourette's often involves a bunch of motor tics, like blinking a lot, making faces, jerking the head, or shrugging the shoulders. And it also includes vocal tics, like clearing the throat, sniffing, grunting, or even yelling out words.
It sounds incredibly difficult to deal with, both physically and socially. I imagine kids with Tourette's face a lot of stigma and misunderstanding.
They do, unfortunately. We need to educate people and raise awareness so we can create a supportive environment for those with soletic disorders. These conditions are neurological, not behavioral. People with teletics deserve compassion and understanding, not judgment or punishment.
Well said. And it seems like childhood depression is another area where awareness and understanding are really important.
It is. Childhood depression is a serious condition that's often missed or misdiagnosed. Kids might be irritable, angry, or have behavioral problems instead of showing sadness.
So parents and caregivers really need to know the signs. Things like ongoing sadness, withdrawing from friends and family, changes in appetite or sleep, trouble concentrating, always feeling tired, and losing interest in things they used to enjoy.
Yes, those are all important signs to watch for. And we have to remember that children's emotions are just as real as adults' emotions. Their struggles are valid, and they deserve care and support.
Absolutely. Childhood is a time of such incredible growth and change, and addressing mental health issues early on can make all the difference in a child's life. But unfortunately, not all challenges are easily overcome. This material also covers intellectual disability, a condition that has lifelong effects.
Right. Intellectual disability is when someone has limitations in both their intellectual functioning and their adaptive skills, which are the skills we need for everyday life. It's a complex condition with a lot of different causes.
And diagnosing intellectual disability involves looking at IQ scores, which measure intelligence, and adaptive functioning, which looks at skills like communication, self-care, and social skills.
Yes. This multifaceted approach acknowledges that intelligence is just one part of a person's overall functioning. It's about supporting individuals with intellectual disability in all areas of their lives.
And speaking of support, we've also been looking at information about the different levels of intellectual disability, ranging from mild to profound.
Right. And it's a spectrum just like autism. People with mild intellectual disability might just need help with certain tasks or during stressful times, while those with profound intellectual disability might need constant care throughout their lives.
So the level of support needed is different for everyone.
Exactly. It's all about tailoring the support to the individual's needs and abilities.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? We've explored the intricate world of childhood disorders, from autism and ADHD to disruptive behavior disorders, anxiety, and intellectual disability. It's clear that mental health challenges can show up in so many different ways.
And it highlights how important awareness, understanding, and early intervention are. By knowing the signs, seeking professional help, and creating a supportive environment, we can help kids face these challenges and thrive.
Well said. But for now, it's time to move on to the different ways we can support mental well-being. We'll explain all of that in the final part of our deep dive.
I'm looking forward to it. There's so much to talk about when it comes to the different interventions and resources that are available.
Okay, so welcome back to the final part of our deep dive.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey so far, hasn't it?
It really has. We've talked about how people thought about mental health throughout history, how we diagnose it, and all those unique challenges that kids face.
Right.
But now I think it's time to talk about solutions. Like,
Yeah.
how do we actually help people who are struggling?
Okay, well, when it comes to mental health interventions, there's a huge variety of approaches. We've got therapy, medication, lifestyle changes, and even community support.
Mm-hmm.
It's really about finding the right combination of things that works best for each person.
It's like having a toolbox filled with different tools.
Exactly, and just like a skilled craftsperson would choose the right tool for the job, a good mental health professional will figure out what someone needs
Okay.
and then put together a treatment plan that's just for them.
So let's open up this toolbox and take a look inside. We hear a lot about therapy being really important for mental health. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure, so therapy or psychotherapy has a lot of different approaches. Some of the most well-known ones are cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT,
Mm-hmm.
psychodynamic therapy, interpersonal therapy, and humanistic therapy.
Okay.
Each one has its own theories and techniques.
We were talking about Freud and his ideas earlier. Is psychoanalysis, his approach, still used a lot today?
Well, psychoanalysis in its original form isn't as popular as it used to be,
Yeah.
but it was really important for how therapy developed.
Okay.
Psychodynamic therapy, which takes some of Freud's core ideas, but is more focused and time-limited, that's still used quite a bit.
So it's like a modern version of those classic ideas.
Hmm.
What about cognitive behavioral therapy? That one seems to be pretty trendy right now.
CBT is definitely one of the most researched and effective therapies we have. It works especially well for anxiety and depression.
Okay.
It focuses on the link between our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. It helps people figure out and challenge negative thinking patterns and then come up with healthier ways of coping.
So it's like learning to change your perspective and react differently to tough situations.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about giving people the skills they need to manage their thoughts, feelings, and actions in a healthier way.
We were also talking about behavior modification before. How does that fit in here?
Okay, well, behavioral therapies concentrate on changing learned behaviors using the principles of conditioning.
Oh, okay.
So think of things like exposure therapy,
Hmm.
where you slowly and carefully expose someone to the thing they're afraid of,
Okay.
or aversion therapy, which pairs an unwanted behavior with something unpleasant.
So it's all about breaking bad habits and building good
That's
ones.
the basic idea.
Okay, that makes sense. What about humanistic therapy? What makes it stand out from the others?
Okay, so humanistic therapy, it's all about empathy, unconditional positive regard,
Okay.
and being genuine. Think about Carl Rogers and his person-centered approach. The therapist is more like a guide, creating this really safe space
Mm.
for people to look at their own experiences, get to know themselves better, and reach their full potential.
It sounds really empowering, like it helps people tap into their inner strength.
Exactly.
So we have all these different types of therapy, each with its own strengths, but I know that medication can also be part of mental health treatment. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. Psychotropic medications, which include things like antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds, mood stabilizers, and antipsychotics.
Okay.
They can be really helpful in managing those symptoms and making life better for people with mental health conditions.
But I bet there's still a lot of stigma around taking meds for mental health.
Yeah, definitely.
It can be a tough decision to make.
It can, and it's really important to remember that these meds work by tackling those imbalances in brain chemistry
Mm-hmm.
that contribute to those mental health symptoms.
Right.
They're not about being weak or taking a shortcut.
Yeah, it's important to understand how they work and talk to a qualified healthcare professional
Right.
to make sure they're the right choice. But it's not all about therapy and medication, is it?
Definitely not.
Lifestyle choices also play a huge role in mental health.
Yeah, you'd be surprised how much simple things like getting enough sleep, regular exercise, and a healthy diet
Mm-hmm.
can really affect your mood, your energy, and your overall mental health.
Right.
These changes are often a really important part of a comprehensive treatment plan.
It's like taking care of your mental health from the inside out.
That's a great way to put it.
And I'm sure social support is important too, right?
Absolutely. Having strong social connections and people who care about you, they're like a shield against stress.
Mm-hmm.
Having people you can count on who listen and encourage you, that can make a world of difference.
It's like a reminder that we're not alone in this.
Right.
And there are so many resources available to help people who are struggling.
Yeah, absolutely. There are mental health centers, support groups, and advocacy organizations that offer all sorts of services. Things like counseling, crisis help, peer support, and educational programs.
Wow, it sounds like there's a whole network of support out there for people with mental health challenges.
There really is, and that's maybe the biggest takeaway from our deep dive today. Mental health is just as important as physical health.
Mm-hmm.
It's something we all need to pay attention to, nurture, and seek support for when we're struggling.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
It's been really great going through all this material with you. It's always amazing to see how much we've learned about mental health and how much more there is to discover.
And to everyone listening, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into psychopathology. I hope you learned something new. Keep learning, challenge the stigma surrounding mental health, and fight for a world where everyone feels supported and valued.
And remember, seeking help when you're struggling is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those hearts open.